Since the founding of their legion at the birth of the Imperium, the Space Marines of the Dark Angels have been dreaded by their enemies and held in awe by those they protect. Stubborn and relentless in battle, ever vigilant and zealous in their pursuit of their duties, the Dark Angels are among the Emperor's most faithful servants. Yet it was not always so. For 10 millennia, the Dark Angels have harbored a sinister secret, an act so terrible and shameful it threatens everything they hold most dear, and may yet bring them eternal damnation. The Dark Angels are considered amongst the most powerful and secretive of the Loyalist Space Marine chapters. They were the first legion of the original 20 Space Marine legions to be created during the first founding of the 30th millennium. Though they claim complete allegiance and service to the Emperor of Mankind, their actions and secret goals at times seem at odds with that professed loyalty, as they strive above all other things to atone for an ancient crime of betrayal committed over 10,000 standard years ago against the trust of the Emperor during the time of the Horus Heresy. The Angels stand first amongst the Space Marine chapters, as they have done since their very inception as the First Legion. They are a proud chapter, with traditions and rituals that date back to the earliest days of the Imperium of Man. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery. Few imperial records of the chapter's beginnings still exist, nor are there many mentions of the part it played in the Emperor's Great Crusade during the early 31st millennium. Most references in the histories of the Imperium to its deeds during the accursed times of the heresy have actually been expunged. Yet a legend persists that at one point the Angels teetered on the very brink of heresy, and that an act of the most terrible betrayal dishonored all of the First Legion's feats of valor, leaving an enduring stain upon all of its successor chapters' honor. Such is their shame that from that time onwards, the Dark Angels and their unforgiven successors, of which there are more than 19 currently in Imperial service, strive for absolution from the sins of millennia past. Their terrible secret is this. During the Horus Heresy, some of their brethren were turned to the side of chaos. The renegades were defeated in a battle that destroyed the Dark Angels' legion homeworld, Caliban. But many of the traitor Dark Angels survived, to be cast through space and time by the direct intervention of the Chaos Gods. These survivors are known to those few Dark Angels granted knowledge of their existence as the Fallen Angels, or just the Fallen. In the eyes of the leaders, there is only one way that the chapter can ever atone for its shame, restoring its honor and trust in the eyes of the Emperor. All of the Fallen must be found and either made to repent their ancient sin or slain. This story of treachery and betrayal is the Dark Angels' hidden shame, and their secret mission to destroy all of the Fallen is now their only hope of salvation. No one knows of this other than the Dark Angels, their successor chapters, and perhaps the Emperor himself interred within his golden throne. The chapter has been shaped by its dark past, and is secretive and monastic in nature, with much time given over to worship and prayer. There are many different levels within the chapter which individuals may gradually rise through. On attaining each new level, they are granted a little more knowledge of the truth behind their origins, but only the highest-ranking members of the chapter, the members of what is known as the Inner Circle, know the terrible, shameful secret of what occurred 10,000 Terran years ago. The Dark Angels hold more battle honors than almost any other chapter. Its only equals are its own successors. The chapter has fought the length and breadth of the Imperium and beyond, against every foe that has ever beset mankind. They have held orc wargs at bay, crushed planetary uprisings, and saved entire star systems from the incursions of the ruinous powers. They have fought across searing deserts, in the cold void of space, in dense carnivorous alien jungles, and in the depths of the wildest underhives. Yet while chapters such as the Blood Angels and the Ultramarines are lauded wherever they fight, the Dark Angels shun laurels and turn their backs upon adulation. Even though the chapter has stood side by side with every major arm of the Imperium's military, it has always maintained a distance and aloofness that sets its brethren further apart from the bulk of humanity, and even from other space marines. When the Dark Angels join a larger force to execute a great war, or Imperial Crusade, they do so according to their own unfathomable goals. When a Dark Angel's force is committed to such a conflict, it invariably remains aloof. Its officers keep their own counsel on matters of tactics and strategy, and prefer to maintain their own lines of communication and supply sources. Even when dealing with the battle brothers of other Astartes chapters, the Dark Angels often remain sullenly quiet at the Space Marine Command Councils and tactical briefings, though that is not to suggest that they are any less effective on the battlefield. When the Dark Angels do undertake joint operations alongside other chapters, it is quite common for them to do so with others amongst the so-called Unforgiven, the successor chapters of the original Dark Angels Legion. The successors of the First Legion maintain especially close relations, their officers all being members of the Inner Circle. This mysterious body provides a ready-made command network that the Unforgiven chapters can utilize to great effect when coordinating their activities. There is no presumption that the leaders of the Dark Angels have any inherent superiority over those of the Unforgiven chapters. Rather, the leaders work together closely, and if needed, elect one of their number as nominal commander for the duration of the campaign. In one matter, however, the officers of the Dark Angels have superiority over those of the other Unforgiven chapters, through the workings of the Inner Circle, the hunt for the fallen. When hunting those turncoat Dark Angels who escaped the fall of Caliban, the Unforgiven operate under the auspices of the highest ranked of the Inner Circle, and the very highest of these is the Supreme Grand Master himself, the Chapter Master of the Dark Angels. Through the machinations of the Unforgiven's Inner Circle, its members are eternally vigilant, never resting in the hunt for the fallen. Even though knowledge of them is withheld from the majority of its brethren, the results of post-battle debriefings and psi-induced stress purges are fed back to the Inner Circle, and any sign of the presence of a fallen analyzed. In addition, the Dark Angels' chaplains are permanently attached to a company, and this allows them to hear the confessions of their brothers and to keep a close watch for signs of the fallen. When such traces are discovered, the Inner Circle moves without hesitation, redeploying Unforgiven forces wherever they happen to be and retasking them with their new target. In most cases, it is the Raven Wing that locates such activity, and the Death Wing that delivers the killing blow. But on occasion, entire Dark Angel strike forces have been recalled from campaigns and committed to engage an enemy that only the highest ranked of its officers have any true knowledge of. While a great deal of the Unforgiven's efforts and resources are committed to the hunt for the fallen, the majority of the brethren have no knowledge of the matter. Rather, the Dark Angels and their successors are constantly warned against the words of the heretic, and their chapter dogma extols the virtues of the eternal hunt for those who would forswear the most powerful of oaths. The company chaplains preach sermons that tell of legendary figures betrayed by their own, often having fought in battles far from home. Numerous such tales exist, and each is revealed as part of a slow, deliberate pattern, the brethren monitored all the while for their reaction. Only upon his ascension to the inner circle is a battle brother told anything approaching the truth, and even then, there are some secrets known only at the very highest tiers. How much of the shame of the Dark Angels a battle brother knows depends upon his station within the chapter, and how far the agents of the inner circle trust him. He may have fought the fallen unwittingly, believing his foe yet another vile traitor worthy only of death. Perhaps his sergeant knew more, certainly his company master did, but he himself almost certainly would not. Conversely, there are some higher-ranked brethren who, despite exemplary service, are never inducted into the inner circle. Perhaps the company chaplains harbor some small doubt or have reason to believe the individual would not be able to bear the terrible truth of what occurred during the Horus Heresy. Such Astartes are unlikely to progress much further, for at the highest levels of authority, the chapter is ever engaged upon the hunt for the fallen. The chapter's history. The Dark Angels were the first of the Emperor's Space Marine legions, and in their earliest incarnation fought as the personal army of the Master of Mankind in the dawning years of the Great Crusade and in the shadowed campaigns that had preceded it. As the prototype of what were to become the Legiones Astartes, they served in the final days of the Unification Wars and the early years of the Great Crusade, both as the template for the more specialized legions that were to come after them, and the standard by which these successors would be measured. They were also among the best equipped of Imperial units, making use of large numbers of advanced archaeotech and plasma weapons. In this period, the Dark Angels were not even known as the First Legion, as no others existed yet, for the Emperor simply referred to them as his Angels of Death, or the Six Hosts. These transhuman troops dominated the final days of the Wars of Unification, easily defeating all their Terran opponents and forcing those among the tech priests of Mars who had intervened in the conflict on Terra in the hope of delaying the Emperor's final victory to sue for peace. From this point on, the First Legion ascended in power and the height of the Emperor's favor. But once the most numerous and powerful of the Space Marine legions, the First Legion's numbers would be depleted, and its primacy ended by the middle years of the Great Crusade, due to the solar decades of savage warfare, particularly in the wars of the Rangdan Xenocides, one of the most apocalyptic campaigns of the Great Crusade. The scars of these battles would change them, as would their reunification with their Primarch, Lionel Johnson, and the introduction of fresh blood from his adopted homeworld of Caliban, a death world dominated by a warlike, feudal society of techno-barbarians. Caliban's warriors' orders provided fertile ground for the Legion's regeneration, and its martial codes and practices were extensively incorporated and adopted by the rebuilding Legion. The origins. Empires, monuments, and legends are built by those who are merely victorious. We were born to kill, not to build. We are not idle long enough to leave monuments, and we leave no work of the enemy intact to spawn legends. We are the First Legion, and he that follows in our wake is death. Attributed to Hector Thrain, a keeper of the Black Gate and the first master of the First Legion. Stark and uncompromising, the Dark Angels were the first of the Emperor's Space Marine legions, and the truest to the mold from which the Legiones Astartes had been struck. They were killers of the purest and most refined kind, for whom there could be no other destiny but a lifetime of war and death in the name of the Imperium and humanity. They did not build empires, made no attempt to master the ways of peace or the subtle skills of the artist, craftsman, or diplomat. They offered no excuses for their nature and made no compromises in the pursuit of their assigned duty, shirking neither the price they paid in blood nor the price paid in infamy and solitude. Their greatest battles are to be found in no catalogue of imperial compliance or roll of honor. No scholars or poets sing of these glories or remember those fallen in their prosecution, for they were fought against foes so monstrous that it was deemed necessary that all mention of them be erased from history. Such was the nature of their service, not only to be prosecutors of the Great Crusade, but also to serve as the Imperium's most potent bulwark against the unknown terrors that lurked in the dark between the stars. The heraldry of the Dark Angels proclaims their lineage, the first of the Emperor's Legiones Astartes. But other than that simple fact, little is known of the origins of the Legion and its initial gene stock. The genesis of the Legiones Astartes as a whole is a subject shrouded in much secrecy. It is perhaps the greatest and most enduring of the Emperor's many works, and the subject scholars have been warned away from in the latter days of his Imperium. What is known with some certainty is that of all the many breeds of these transhuman warriors, the Dark Angels were conceived by the Emperor as a template and prototype for those that would follow, distilled from the genetic code of the most stable of all of his Primarchs, and without any attempt to foster specific traits or curb the eccentricities of the stock from which they sprang. Even so, the process by which these first samples were produced was long and laborious, initiated perhaps a standard century or more before the end of the Unification Wars of Terra, and consuming a vast number of test subjects to produce but a handful of stable proto-Astartes. These initial creations, referenced in fragmentary records, unearthed in the Imperial archives as the primordial strain, almost none are known to have survived initial combat trials and surgical testing. But they form the basis for the initial cultures of the First Legion and, by merit of the refined process formulated with their creation, the other Space Marine legions as well. This grand experiment exacted a bloody toll upon those territories controlled by the Emperor, for its most critical components were untainted human subjects, all within a specific range of age and physical fitness. Given the state of Terra in the wake of the Wars of Old Night, its surface polluted by the twin scourges of atomic bombardment and genetic phage, such subjects were limited. The initial experiments were conducted with the youth of the Emperor's conquered foes, and those purchased from the nomadic clans of slavers that abounded in the wastes of pre-Unity Terra. Later, the toll was borne by flesh tithes exacted on those territories brought, willingly or not, into the fold of the Imperium. As such, the Dark Angels did not bear the stamp of any single gene stock, unlike some of the other legions during their earliest years, whose character had been molded by the nature of their initial intake. Their first recruits, selected from the best of the stock available to the Emperor, were diverse in origin and shared no single cultural heritage that would shape the way in which they made war. Indeed, the diversity of their origins brought a wealth of disparate martial traditions into the fledgling legion. The dour infantry of the Frankish plains and islands of Albia brought with them the brutal coda that had conquered half the ruined lands of the continent of Europa. The warriors of the far Anatolic steppes, a skill at cavalry warfare. The berserkers of frozen Scandia, a murderous efficiency. And from a dozen other Terran cultures, yet more of the arts of war. The First Legion was the crucible in which all the savage lore of old Night, all the bitter knowledge and red-handed wisdom accumulated in millennia of war was to be distilled and fashioned into a weapon of rare potency. In those first faltering years of the grand experiment that was the Legiones Astartes, the proto-warriors of the First Legion, barely a few hundred strong, were encouraged to eschew the names of their own people and embrace a new unity unmarked by old loyalties, often taking instead the names of heroes from the old tales that had survived the Age of Strife. In the first rolls of honor of the Legion can be found Gilgamesh, Heracles, Tarkon, Hengist, and other names imbued by time with the power of legend. Combined with the grim aspect granted them by the gene seed of the first Primarch, these warriors quickly gained a reputation among the disparate throng that was at that time the army of the Emperor, for they seemed as a band of gods, all cast from a singular and potent mold. Fighting at first as small groups within the ranks of the Emperor's host, plying both the skills of their origins and of the drill masters of the Imperial laboratories of the Biotechnical Division, they would come to be known as the Uncrowned Princes, or simply Crowns. This was a homage both to their place in the line of battle and the destiny bestowed upon them by their creator, a title that would inspire both a sense of unity and a certain arrogance in the first Space Marines and spur them to lead the way amongst the growing brotherhood of the Legiones Astartes. This, in the Legion's earliest moments, was the genesis of the hosts of the First Legion, which would later be refined by their Primarch, Lionel Johnson, into the hexagrammation wings of his Dark Angels, a myriad of informal groups within the early companies of the Legion that worked to adapt the doctrines of battle brought from those disparate origins and create a coda of battle fit for the transhuman armies of the Emperor. The hosts were not bound by company or commander, and existed throughout the Legion. At any given battle or engagement, at least some small number of a given host would be present to advise and lead should their expertise be required. In the early years of the First Legion's existence, there were many more hosts than would later exist under the hexagrammation organization, with as many as 18 such formations noted by their distinct heraldry in the earliest records of the Unification Wars where the Astartes appear. The Third Siege of Antioch in 603 M30 saw the participation of 9 distinct hosts across 4 separate companies of the Legion, though at this point they numbered less than 30 warriors each and displayed significant tactical overlap in the methods they employed to breach the walls of that ancient enclave. Time would see the many hosts of those chaotic years quickly resolved into a smaller number of more focused hosts. But in those early years, with their brother legions still but handfuls of warriors newly cast from a rough mold, the First Legion became the test bed for the various tactics and doctrines that would later become the Principia Bellicosa. As the other legions grew to a size large enough to engage in small-scale combat actions, some of the more specialized hosts became obsolete, unnecessary in the face of warriors more adept at the style of warfare, while others were made extinct by the inadequacies of their methods and the brutal nature of war in the 30th millennium. Far from harming the Legion, this process of bloody evolution left it strong, a weapon well honed by the fighting on Terra. It also forged a bond between the disparate warriors who made up that early Legion, a bond based upon the sense of superiority and distinction instilled in them by the servants of the Emperor that trained them and the awe they inspired in those they fought beside. The fall of the Thunder Warriors. As with all the Legiones Astartes, the First Legion was intended as a replacement for the brigades of the Thunder Warriors, that unstable experiment in the creation of Proto-Astartes which, by the middle years of the Unification Wars, had run its course. The Thunder Warriors' regiments had been the tool needed for their time, an unrefined and savage weapon to match the grim tyrants and debauched potentates that had inherited old Earth during the Age of Strife. Yet, in comparison to the Legiones Astartes, they were a rough breed, powerful to be sure, perhaps even individually more so than their new transhuman kin, but unable to quell their fury to work in unison. They were a mob, a storm of fury and blaze that rolled over its foes, while the Legiones Astartes were a true army, and in their unity could withstand any onslaught. Tales and theories beyond count surrounded the Thunder Warriors and their sudden disappearance from the Imperium's history, most being fabrications and sophistry of the worst kind, though a few warrant further regard. One such tale is of note, a tale told among the nomadic tribes that inhabit the wastelands around Mount Ararat, and speaks not only of Thunder Warriors, but also of an army clad all in grey, dark as the clouds of a storm, and branded all as one. These warriors, so say the hill nomads, await the return of the few surviving Thunder Warriors, exhausted by their victory, and rather than giving salute to their valor, cut them down in a thunderous volley of bolt and plasma. This tale is far different from the heroic tale told by the Remembrances to mark the end of the Unification Wars, but in keeping with the brutal necessities of the Emperor's far-reaching plans. It is possible that the warriors branded all as one could be the First Legion, who all bore the sigil of their numeration bold upon their battle plate, for battles of that legion were oft removed from imperial record, the details expunged and forgotten. Actual proof, however, does not exist, not even in the archives of the Imperial Palace. Yet several anecdotes from the later years of the Great Crusade do seem to support the theory, all related to a near-obsessive preoccupation with the hunting down and destruction of those few renegade Thunder Warriors that survived and fled Terra, over and above the standing orders of the Imperial Court to suppress all such renegades. On at least 3 occasions, fleets of the First Legion altered course in order to engage and destroy Thunder Warrior survivors, often making wide detours based on simple rumors of such activity. Such an obsession is notable for what was an otherwise stoic Space Marine Legion, and would seem to hint at a more personal interest in the resolution of any encounter with surviving Thunder Warriors, perhaps even a sense of shame in having allowed any to escape some previous engagement. Another ancient source claims that even before the Unification Wars had ended, the Thunder Warriors, already jealous of their replacements' long lives and near immortality compared to their own inevitable descent into madness and death, at last realized that their creator had cursed them with short lifespans as a result of their imperfect genetic augmentations. In their rage and fear, they turned upon the Emperor for what they saw as his betrayal. It was a cadre of several hundred custodians of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's lifeguard, even then believed to have been led by the legendary Constantine Valdor and accompanied by several thousand prototype Astartes of the First Legion of the newborn Space Marines that stood in the Emperor's defense, carrying out a merciless culling of the obsolete and rebellious Gene soldiers. However, given the renowned secrecy of the First Legion and the frequency with which their campaigns and deeds were obfuscated by Imperial decree, it is unlikely that the truth of this matter will ever be known. The First Legion was intended to demonstrate the true potential of the Astartes versus their predecessors among the Emperor's armies, for they were a true legion, numbering already 10,000 transhuman warriors, while their early kin among the other nascent legions were but a few hundred each. It was at Samarkand on Terra in 668 M30 during the Unification Wars that the First Legion took to the field en masse for the first time, assembled with the Emperor himself at their head. Here, the Legiones Astartes faced their first true test. Not a test of individual strength or genetic purity, but a test of their worth as an army. 10,000 of the first, flanked by contingents of 4 other legions, took the field against 200,000 gene-forged Uduk Hul, the elite slave soldiers of the King of Akkad. The Uduk Hul, whose blood was poison, and whose strength was greater than 10 unenhanced warriors, were the terror of the Upper Asiatic Basin and a foe that had so far resisted the advance of the Emperor's armies. 10 solar hours after battle was joined, Samarkand was in ruins, the Uduk scattered and broken, and the great King of Akkad's head, a trophy on the belt of the newly appointed Grand Master of the First Legion. This warrior, Hector Thrain, was lauded by the princes of Terra for his victory and granted the title Sinestra of the Emperor, the left hand of the warlord of Terra, his most fearsome instrument of conquest. By order of the Emperor, the First Legion left no stone upon stone, and almost every record of the terrors encountered in that battle was destroyed. In the wake of the victory, the rate of recruitment and processing of the new Space Marine legions was accelerated, their potential proven in triumph, and the First Legion gained a dark renown among the ranks of the armies of Unity. They had walked into the mouth of Hell, and not only had they returned, but they had left Hell shattered in their passage. This first victory was to set the pattern of the First Legion's battles during the wars for Old Earth and the Sol System, pitting them against the most horrific of foes, with only one objective: to eradicate them completely. From Fortress 31 in the Thalian wastes of ancient Terra to the Battle of Karnakon amid the cryo-volcanic mountains of Sedna, the First Legion would meet the worst threats that faced the armies of Unity and lay them low. So horrific were many of the threats they faced, Xenos terrors beyond the pale of sanity, and psychic phenomena that threatened to tear reality asunder, that little more than the battle honors remain, the details erased even from the data stacks of the Emperor's library. To prosecute these impossible battles, the Emperor would grant them access to the armory vaults of the Imperial Palace, to every forbidden weapon entombed within, and they would be the only legion trusted to wield the worst of mankind's creations freely. The orders of Grand Master Hector Thrain would see the obliteration of the warped cities of Khadun and Malay and the eastern reaches of Old Earth, and the deployment of gene-phage munitions to purge Enceladus, one of the moons of Saturn, clean of Crave infestation. These were victories that left an indelible stain on both the course of the war and the identity of the warriors who prosecuted them, forging Thrain's reputation as a ruthless and prideful warlord. Among the armies of unification, the First Legion had become synonymous with death, for where they walked, it seemed as though that pale rider followed after them with an inevitability that spawned many long-held superstitions regarding reclusive warriors of the First. They were treated with an awe that sat somewhere between respect and terror by those who served alongside them, for it was said that to offend them was to bring the scrutiny of their patron, Death himself, upon the offender. Among the host gathered by the Emperor, they were not heroes, but rather a breed of monster, made loyal by the will of their master. They were not to be lauded for their bravery, but rather placated to assuage their wrath. Despite the dictates of the Imperial truth, the common soldiery of the Imperial armies often set small wards and charms at the edges of their camps when the First Legion arrived to avert the ill luck that many felt followed the Emperor's firstborn legion. Such superstition was not without cause, for of those Imperial formations attached to support the First Legion in combat, most came to bloody ends. Some were savaged by the monsters that the newly dubbed Angels of Death had come to slay, and others would simply vanish, purported to have been silenced by the First Legion themselves, lest word of some dread enemy return to the camps with the survivors. The warriors of the First Legion, ever a pragmatic mind, soon began to assume the guise in which they had been cast, adopting the skeletal icon of death as their own and adorning their armor with funerary symbols. This self-imposed exile from the camaraderie of the Emperor's lesser servants was a point of pride among the First Legion. It was a sacrifice made to protect the mortal army from the terrors only the First Legion were fit to bear, though to some of those they fought beside, most especially the warriors of the other Legiones Astartes, it seemed more vainglory and arrogance than humble sacrifice. The masters of the First Legion showed no interest in such slights, content to remain wreathed in malign rumor as they fought the battles that could never be lauded, lest they break the minds of those who bore witness to the battle honors. For while the younger legions were granted the lesser honor of standing triumphant at the mundane victories of conquest, the First Legion would be awarded the greater honor of acting as the Emperor's left hand, a brutally efficient weapon of grim aspect hidden behind the bright pageantry of the Imperial army. The early Great Crusade. The Emperor's own Angels of Death. This was an honor they would bear throughout the war to unify the Sol system and beyond, a duty that kept them separate from the other Space Marine legions created in their image. As the younger legions slowly began to reach the nominal strength required for the beginning of the Emperor's Great Crusade, the First Legion conducted a lonely vigil far from the light of Sol, scouring clean the Oort cloud and keeping watch along the heliopause border of the system for those terrors that sought to slip unnoticed into the Emperor's newly claimed domain. This duty they accepted without complaint, taking pride in the role selected for them by the Emperor, for they were his Angels of Death, a name which at that time belonged to them alone. For nearly a solar decade they would dwell in the lightless depths of mankind's home star system, burning clean the frozen moons of the outer system and freeing the few lost outposts of humanity that still survived at the very outermost edges of the Sol system. Here, the informal network of specialists within the Legion became the first of its formations called Orders, dedicated to a singular focus of war beyond the wider scope of the Legion's existing hosts. their craft honed in the battles at the dark edge of Sol, and the complex ciphers and rituals by which they recorded it entrenched over the long years of isolation. It was by the hard-won knowledge of these warriors that the Legion would prevail again and again in the most grueling and hazardous battles faced by the warriors of the Emperor, the weaknesses of each foe exposed by sacrifice and encoded in the traditions of the orders and the secrets of war in any environment catalogued in their archives. The Legion would return to the inner worlds purged of weakness and hardened by adversity, their armor no longer the flat grey of the other legions, but a deep and impassive black. There would be no fanfare on their return to the Emperor's side, no parades of victory, merely the silent approval of the Emperor of mankind, and a place at the vanguard of the host that mustered ready to make war upon a hostile galaxy to save humanity from extinction. Despite the hardships that would await them and the mighty foes they would face, none could doubt victory, having witnessed the grim resolve and stoic pride in the faces of the black-clad warriors as they took their place at the head of the host. There, amid the vast muster that took place around the shipyards of Saturn, the fleet granted to the First Legion stood out among the newly built Saturnine pattern vessels and the ancient ships reawakened from the macro vaults of Mars, for the First Legion were granted the honor of a tithe of those few remaining Terran ships. These ancient voidcraft almost all dated back to the years before Old Night, relics of forgotten technologies and lost aspirations of grandeur. Among them were to be found massive Gloriana-class battleships, Promethean-class cruisers clad in dense layers of void shields, and weapon-studded Tiamat-class destroyers, all far surpassing more modern designs in potency, made available to few other than the Emperor's own guards. To each of his other legions he bequeathed but a handful of such ships, while to the First Legion he granted a fleet. This gift was not a simple reward for the heroics they had displayed in the fighting on Old Earth and beyond, but rather a necessary tool for those actions yet to come. For as the armies of the Emperor set forth on the Great Crusade and pushed beyond the edges of those few star charts that had survived Old Night, they encountered such terrors that the battles on Terra were made to seem inconsequential by comparison. These dark places among the stars, the First Legion would find the reason for their reward, for in order to fight the monsters the Emperor had foreseen in his path, they would need monstrous weapons. Alone among the Legiones Astartes, they would make common use of the forbidden weaponry of Old Night, of Gene Fade and Rad Wave, employed to wipe clean the nests of those enemies deemed too terrible to be faced in open battle. The First Legion were the fulcrum of the Emperor's wrath, the agency of his hate, for they brought not simple destruction, but the all-encompassing oblivion of utter annihilation. They were the Angels of Death, a title that would one day encompass all of the Emperor's Space Marines, but in those brutal early days of conquest and blood, it was theirs alone. Even as other legions fought to bring those human colonies discovered by the expeditionary fleets to Imperial compliance, the First Legion fought to hold back the hate of a galaxy filled with terrors. They took war to the dens of monsters and legends without fear or hesitation, shattering the hold of nightmares on the future of mankind. Though only in the most secure vaults in the Imperial archives do any records of these battles remain. They speak of Betelgeuse 4, where the third chapter, formed mainly of warriors from the hosts of stone and iron, assaulted a world whose mountains and crust had been hollowed out to form a fortress for a swarm creature of protoplasmic and hyperacidic slime, the nucleus of an infection that had spread through the void to infest a dozen worlds and seen millions rendered into little more than a nutrient slurry for the beasts. Scattered picts show the shattered husks of the once verdant world of the Osirine cluster, where the First Legion's 19th Expeditionary Fleet engaged a vast, sentient planet killer, a technological abomination spawned by some long-forgotten empire and left to wreak havoc upon an uncaring universe. The records of the battle itself sealed by Grandmaster Hector Thrain. These horrors and 1,000 more were exterminated by the warriors of the First Legion, and all trace of the campaigns erased from records to protect the sanity of those unprepared for the raw mindless hate of the universe laid bare. To those outside the ranks of the First, their record in the early years of the Great Crusade seems at best lacking in comparison to their brother legions, and at worst a fabrication. With many of their greatest triumphs shrouded in secrecy, they had less conventional triumphs to their name, merely a handful of worlds brought to compliance where hundreds had burned in silence. What few know was that it was in the sacrifice and valor of the First Legion that many of the Legiones Astartes' key doctrines were forged, with such tomes as the Principia Bellicosa formed, in part, from the strategies and tactics perfected by them as each of the Legion's hosts strove to refine their own brand of warfare upon the most vile battlefields of the Great Crusade. Those that thrived on the field of battle would grow and pass their knowledge on, not only to their battle brothers within the Legion, but to those without, through the doctrines created in their wake. While those that struggled would fade from the roster of the Legion, ground to extinction by the inexorable hunger of war. A fortress of pride. These trials would shape the First Legion into a fearsome weapon, the largest and most heavily armed of all of the Legiones Astartes during the early years of the Great Crusade. They fielded more warriors under arms, maintained a larger fleet, and had access to weaponry more powerful than any of their brother legions at that time, even those such as the Lunar Wolves and Space Wolves, which had already been reunited with their Primarchs. The Grandmaster of the First Legion stood at the left hand of the Emperor, one of the most influential personages in the early Imperial Court, whose council was second only to that of Malcador the Sigillite and Horus Lupercal. Despite the hidden nature of many of their triumphs, they were acknowledged by all as preeminent among their transhuman kin, the most powerful force at arms in the serried ranks of the Imperial armies. In those heady years of conquest and victory, the First Legion stood true to their name at the apex of Imperial might, feared by those who stood against the Emperor and his dream of unity, and respected by all those who fought at their side. Yet, as with all things, the glory of the First Legion would be a fragile thing, and one that could endure only for a short time before becoming something less than it once was. For the First Legion, in those days before the return of their Primarch, the great foe that would topple them from their place of honor would not be any terror from the outer dark, but rather their own hubris. For though the black cruisers of the legions were ever to be found at the edges of the map, hunting for monsters in the dark between the stars, they now took a perverse pride in pitting themselves against only the most powerful of foes, those that wielded a power equal to that of their own, those in whom they saw the possibility of defeat. Other threats, deemed too insignificant for the First Legion, too weak to pose a real challenge, foes that would not test their strategies or mettle, would often be bypassed and left to the Imperial Army regiments and other Legion fleets that followed in their wake. Yet with each encounter they grew only stronger. No enemy, no matter how powerful or destructive, could stop them, and each triumph only added to the shield of arrogance they had built about themselves. The stubborn pride that had sustained them through hardships unnumbered now became a double-edged blade. The hexagrammaton, once an ever-shifting body of knowledge that changed to match each challenge, had become fixed in place. The warriors of the First, assuming that they had reached the apex of skill and could learn no more. Recruitment from outside their ancient enclaves on Terra and a few other worlds slowed to but a trickle, with those from outside the traditional recruiting grounds considered less valuable. Each battle led them further down the path of willful arrogance, each victory hailed as a triumph of their skill, and each defeat dismissed as the folly of lesser breeds of warrior, and leaders rightfully culled from the Legion by their failure. Tradition and ritual became more valued than innovation, with each order and host jealously guarding their own small fragments of the Legion's battle lore, certain that it was this scrap of knowledge that was the true heart of the Legion's success. The Legion began to turn in upon itself, the openness and inquisitive nature of their early years slowly being replaced by a secretive and tradition-bound approach. They had begun the Great Crusade as mentors and guides for the other legions, seeking out the stratagems and tactics through which the potential of the Legiones Astartes might be fully realized. But now came more and more to resent those they had once guided. The other legions claimed world after world for the Emperor, easy victories in the eyes of the First Legion, trivial conquests against unworthy foes, yet ones for which they received laurels and praise equal to that of the First Legion's hard-won battles. Some also came to rival the power of the First. The Ultramarines, now reunited with their Primarch Guilliman, could claim more warriors under arms, and the Imperial Fists under Rogal Dorn boasted the firepower of immense relics such as the Phalanx in their fleets. To a legion that had built its pride upon a sense of authority, some might say superiority, to find itself now merely one among many would shake its foundations. Perhaps the final blow to their fragile pride was to come at Canis Bala, where simple conquest and stubborn complacency became ignominy and disaster. Here, in an otherwise insignificant star system home to a Xenos breed, as yet uncatalogued by the sage brothers of the Legion's orders of extinction and annihilation, the First Legion and its Grand Master committed a small force to the assault, confident in their ability to prevail and secure in the tested strategies of the hosts and orders. Yet the Xenos of Canis Bala, their identity long since purged from records, proved a threat unlike any faced before, fighting without regard for sane tactics and with a technology that defied rational explanation. The First Legion's initial attack was repulsed with heavy losses, an indignity that the First Legion had not known for solar decades. Defeat was a foe that they thought they had conquered, and pride began to cloud their wisdom. A second assault followed, and then a third, each repulsed in turn with mounting losses. With his faultless record now tainted, and his pride sorely wounded, Grand Master Hector Thrain led one final assault himself, refusing to accept that any might equal his own warriors in skill and tenacity. This assault, even weakened by the losses already sustained, cut a swath through the Xenos forces defending the planet, but could not overcome the sheer numerical superiority of the foe. Overwhelmed, it teetered on the brink of annihilation. Grandmaster Thrain, realizing the folly of pride that had driven him into battle, chose to remain behind with his lifeguard, sacrificing himself to allow the retrieval of valuable combat assets. The world of Canis Bala was reduced to ashes from orbit, all trace of life on its surface incinerated in nucleonic fire, a measure that many argued should have been taken earlier had pride not forced their hand. All records of the alien foe the Legion had fought were sealed away, though they would later be recovered by the Order of Broken Claws before being sealed once again for reasons equally lost to history. The loss, both of the battle and of Grandmaster Thrain, proved a catalyst for turmoil among the ranks of the Legion. Each of the masters of its hosts and the preceptors of its orders were sure that had their doctrines been given primacy, they could have turned the tide of battle. A subtle struggle for power erupted among the complex tiers of authority within the Legion, a struggle that slowed the pace of their conquests and threatened to unseat the Legion from its preeminent position of honor once and for all. The ill-made night. This struggle was fought most fiercely upon the floor of the First Legion's Great Hall of Council on the world of Grammari, at the heart of the Legion. There, where once the masters and preceptors of the Legion had created much of the wisdom that now guided the Legiones Astartes as a whole, a storm of vitriol and admonition had erupted. Each of the masters of the Legion, unable or unwilling to see fault in their own wisdom, sought to attach it to that of their fellows, so that it might be excised from the First Legion. Most contentious of all was the selection of a new Grand Master, for few would countenance the selection of a warrior from a host of the First other than their own. As the pace of the First Legion's conquest slowed, and the deliberations of the Council of Masters stagnated, it would be the intercession of Malcador the Sigillite, first among the Emperor's confidants, to break the deadlock. Rather than present some censure on behalf of the Emperor, he chose instead to sponsor a candidate of his own, seeking to stir the Legion from its doldrums and return them wholeheartedly to war. His words to the Council of Masters were carved upon the lintel of the chamber. Such was their impact. Quote, "A fortress can be held upright by many pillars. Alone they are nothing, but together they are mighty. Yet a fortress must have a master, or else all its strength is for nothing." End quote. The warrior nominated by the Sigillite was elected by unanimous vote of the Council of Masters. He was neither a master of the hosts nor a preceptor of the orders, but a war-worn captain from among the vast ranks of the First Legion. Malcador's logic was impeccable, for such a candidate stood for no one branch of the Legion's arts alone, but rather for all as one. Where any of the venerable masters would find nothing but opposition from their peers, a simple warrior found acceptance from all. The warrior chosen was Urian Vendraig, once captain of the 14th Company of the 8th Chapter, a Tyran taken into the Legion after the Emperor had united that war-torn world, and with a grand record of victory as his banner and as yet uninitiated into the inner mysteries of any one host or order. His was a legacy of bloodshed in battle, of rousing speeches and glorious last stands. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with his battle brothers through all his service, and spent but little time in doctrinal debate. His new task was to unify a divided legion and return them to the Great Crusade, and the purpose laid out for them by the Emperor unburdened by doubt and division. As a warrior first and foremost, Vendrake saw the value of bringing the Legion fully into the Emperor's Great Crusade, taking its rightful place at the head of their brothers rather than only serving at the fringes of history. For the first time in the Great Crusade, a small contingent of carefully selected remembrances was allowed to join the Grand Master's entourage, attached to his personal guard and given strictly limited access to the Legion's records, so that they might bear witness to the First Legion's ascension. All that remained was to find a challenge worthy of the Legion, some terrible foe to bind them once again in hatred of the enemy, and, as though gifted to them by the Emperor, word arrived of the new terror encountered on the far rim of the Great Crusade, a race known to history as the Rangdan. Encountered by the 105th Pioneer Company of the 5th Legion on an isolated world along the northern rim of the galaxy, the Rangdan were considered a grave threat to the expanding Imperium. Though at that time their territory was thought to encompass only a single star system, they possessed a vile technology and fearsome aspect that warranted the most extreme of responses. Mustering a fleet numbering hundreds of capital-class warships, the new Grand Master descended upon the isolated system of Advex Mors, where the Rangdan had created a vast artificial war moon, an immense engine of war that had cost millions of slave laborers from 100 worlds their lives. This monstrous weapon was defended by a fleet of lumpen and ugly Rangdan warbarks, each bristling with weapons and crewed by slaves whose neural collars enforced their unflinching obedience. The battle that ensued would leave the system of Advex Mors as little more than ashes and rubble. All 6 worlds claimed by the Rangdan were rendered uninhabitable, their fleets reduced to drifting fields of wreckage, and their vast slave armies utterly annihilated. The campaign lasted for 4 solar months and cost the lives of some 5,000 of the First Legion. But as the banner of the Imperium was raised over those broken fragments of the Rangdan war moon that had rained down upon the burned husk of Advex Mors beneath, the Imperium was reminded of the sheer power of the First Legion. The First Rangdan Xenocide and the Battle of Advex Mors. Of all the campaigns waged by the First Legion, it is their battles against the Rangdan that have most intrigued historians and scholars, for the veil of secrecy cast over these engagements has served only to make the myths that have taken the place of truth all the more grand. There is little information to be found outside of the most carefully guarded sections of the Imperial archives, and the records of the Dark Angels themselves, a legion well known for rigorously maintaining its many secrets. However, for the first of the great wars against the Rangdan, there is another source of information available to us, the data cores of the rebel forge world of Xana II, raided and burned by loyalist forces during the Great Scouring. Before its dark magi fled into exile, much information was recovered from the forge world that the First Legion could not seal away. It is from these meticulously gathered scraps of knowledge that a true picture of the first battle between the Dark Angels and the Rangdan can be formed. The First Legion gathered a mighty armada for the assault on the world of Advex Mors, some 50,000 warriors of the First Legion and another 100,000 support troops drawn from both Imperial Army regiments and Mechanicum Tagmata forces from nearby Xana, as well as near a full 100 capital-class starships and many times that of smaller escort craft. At that time, this was a fearsome force of arms, but one still reckoned lacking by many for the task they had set themselves. The initial reports from the 5th Legion fleet that had made the first charts of Advex Mors painted a grim picture for the assault force. For the 6th world of the Advex Mors system were heavily fortified and garrisoned, so much so that the strategos of the Divisio Militaris would initially believe this, erroneously, to be the seat of the Rangda's power in our galaxy, rather than the isolated outpost it was later found to be. Vast legions of captured humans and other more exotic breeds of slave awaited the Imperial attackers, slave soldiers bound to their Rangdan masters by cruel neural collars that enforced absolute loyalty and reduced them to little more than savage drones to the Xenos that commanded them. The Rangdan themselves possessed many horrific weapons, the product of a vile technology created solely for destruction and subjugation, the ultimate expression of which was the vast war moon that sat in orbit of Advex Mors Primus. This immense engine of war could match the firepower of a full fleet of starships and bore armor capable of shrugging off strikes from capital-scale weaponry. It would prove the greatest obstacle to the invasion and the most terrible symbol of the Rangda's power and malevolent ingenuity. The 1st Legion, led by their new Grand Master Urian Vendraig, welcomed the challenge presented them. Indeed, to succeed in the face of overwhelming odds and prove the valor of his legion was one of the core goals Vendraig had assigned the campaign, a return to glory for the 1st Legion. In honor of this goal, the fighting began in grand style as the assembled Imperial fleet tore an opening in the fabric of space to translate into Advex Mors a single wedge of steel and guns. This feat of navigation, impressive in its own right, was overshadowed by the sheer might of the fleet assembled, with the leading squadron comprising no less than 3 Gloriana-class battleships, the Invincible Reason, the Paradigm of Hate, and the Truce Razor. Those few scattered squadrons of Rangdan warp barks able to oppose the sudden appearance of the Imperium's fleet were quickly swept aside by the sheer strength of the 1st Legion's gathered ships. Even the foul weaponry of the Rangdan Voidcraft and apathetic bravery of the neural thralls that crewed them could not slow the Imperium's advance, though the complex electromagnetic weapons employed by those ships, often called shadow blasters by the naval crews for the ominous shadows left behind by their atomized victims, left many crewmen crippled by radiation sickness. The invasion of Advex Mors Extremis followed these initial successes in orbit, with the Grand Master himself deploying at the head of the 1st Legion's 8th chapter to spearhead the assault. Advex Extremis possessed only limited strategic worth, playing host to a small facility that refined fuel from the vast seas of liquid hydrogen trapped beneath the thick icy crust, and was defended by only a small garrison of slave soldiers and a single Rangdan overseer. Yet, despite this, its value to the morale of the invasion force and as a statement of the 1st Legion's power was immense. 1,000 warriors of the 1st Legion took to the field against 10,000 of the foe, a frenzied wave of flesh puppets sent by their Xenos overlord into a mindless fury to spend their lives recklessly that the foe might be crushed. The dark wave of mind-slaved warriors washed over the 1st Legion's lines and was shattered and broken by the Legiones Astartes in a battle that lasted but 3 short solar hours, at a cost to them of less than 200 casualties. Urian Vendraig himself descended into the boreal hell of the ice mines and slew the Rangdan overlord in personal combat, emerging to hoist its head before the assembled warriors of his legion. This is how the fighting went on the 4 outer worlds, each small garrison isolated by the vast Imperial fleet and destroyed in detail by different detachments of the First Legion, each testing and probing the foe for weaknesses. The Rangdan spent the lives of their slaves profligately to bleed the Legion, sending tens of thousands to their deaths to slow their advance and cull the numbers of the invaders, losing but a handful of true Rangdan as the First Legion celebrated their victories. Within the space of a few short solar months, the Imperium's fleet had crushed the 4 outermost planets of the system and stood upon the threshold of Advex Mors Primus. Here would begin the true battle. For, as the First Legion had spent its time subjugating the outer worlds, the Rangdan had gathered all their strength amongst the huge, shielded fortresses of Advex Mors Primus, and in its skies hung the vast war moon, a sentinel of huge and terrifying power. Here there would be no simple triumph, and the First Legion turned to a far more daring plan to secure victory. Knowing that any effort to destroy the war moon by means of sustained orbital assault would result in massive casualties and allow the planet beneath even more time to fortify and prepare, Grandmaster Vendraig planned to strike both targets at once, using the might of his Astartes warriors. A single chapter of the Legion would attack the war moon under cover of a diversionary attack by the fleet and disable it from within, while the majority of the Legion would conduct a massive planetary landing and crush the world's capital in a single, focused assault. The phalanx of heavy Imperial battleships advanced on Advex Mors Primus, but unlike previous engagements, the Lumpen Xenos defense barges did not rush headlong to meet them and be torn apart by the heavy guns of the First Legion. Instead, the Rangdan craft formed a defensive constellation about the war moon, denying the Imperial fleet any easy opening by which to deploy landing craft or make a concerted assault, and displaying a level of tactical awareness hitherto unexpected by the Emperor's forces, who were now forced to attack into the concentrated guns of the foe. The space around Rangdan erupted in light, as the two fleets clashed above the immense face of the war moon, and hundreds of thousands of guns let fly, punctuating the void with both the yellow flash of Imperial macro cannons and the malefic green flare of Rangdan shadow blasters. Within the first few moments, both fleets had lost entire squadrons of craft, with concentrated weapons fired from the innumerable guns of the war moon, ripping apart even the most heavily shielded of Imperium voidcraft and spreading storms of debris across the battle zone. This was a war of attrition the Imperium's forces had wanted to avoid and could ill afford to prolong, but one they could not easily abandon without ceding control of Advex Mors Primus to the enemy. It would only be the sacrifice of the battleship Paradigm of Hate that would finally turn the tide of the engagement. The ancient battleship, its void shields flaring as it strove to absorb the sheer weight of fire thrown at it, plowed into the enemy's formation and scattered the lesser ships of the Rangdan. Infested by Rangdan's stalker drones and badly wounded by the exotic directed energy weapons of the Xenos craft, the Paradigm of Hate slammed into the vast hull of the war moon, gouging a deep wound in its metal hide. The survivors of its crew and the contingent of First Legion warriors aboard the battleship took up defensive positions within the shattered wreck of their vessel, and set the plasma reactor to reach catastrophic overload, even as the Rangdan hosts aboard the vast war moon moved to overwhelm them. A brief and bloody action was fought in the cold void on the war moon's surface, with full detachments of towering Rangdan warriors committed to battle for the first time. Brutally strong and armed with weapons of terrible power, the Rangdan proved a match for the Legiones Astartes, both sides inflicting serious casualties upon their foe, but the Rangdan could not overrun the First Legion's defenses in time to prevent the Paradigm of Hate's vengeance. The warriors that had once rowed the proud ship into war sacrificed themselves that she might strike one last blow against the foe, her reactors exploding like a miniature sun, crippling the vast war moon and spreading a deadly storm of debris across high orbit. With its death, the battleship had brought the rest of the fleet a brief respite, a chance to press the foe, and the orbital battle quickly fell into a chaotic melee of intermixed starships and squadrons, each locked in a desperate struggle for survival in a mass of duels between individuals and squadrons. The remaining Imperial battleships, Invincible Reason, Truce, Razor, blasted a path into low orbit, weathering enemy attack craft and strikes from ground-based weapons platforms to begin landing ground forces, abandoning any attempt to capture the shattered and silent war moon. As the sky filled with the light of 1,000 tiny battles fought in the void, the massed forces of the First Legion made planetfall, a rain of drop pods falling on the wastelands away from the chain of fortresses that girded the equator, while several smaller forces dispersed in squadrons of gunships and Stormbird transports. It would be these smaller forces that saw action first, mounting raids on the nearest fortresses and those columns of Rangdan slave soldiers sent to investigate the landing zone, buying time with the blood of the enemy for their brothers to array themselves for battle. For the first day, these raiding columns, mostly led by the warriors of the Order of Crows and the marshals of the hosts of wind and fire, bore the brunt of the fighting. At first, they only had to contend with lesser forces of slave soldiers, driven into their path by the Rangdan to weaken them and easily bested by the battle-hardened Legiones Astartes. But they would also be the first to face the true Rangdan in combat. Little is known of the alien enemy those warriors faced, that they were towering creatures of fell strength, inhuman cunning, and bearing the products of a cruel technology that equaled or even exceeded that of mankind is common to all tales that would later be told. The warriors that fought these initial battles suffered terribly, many of the columns reduced to less than half their original strength as they fended off the Rangdan, and several were annihilated entirely. But the information they procured was priceless indeed. The tactics, weaponry, and character of the Rangdan were laid bare to Grandmaster Vendraig, though at the cost of several hundred of his finest warriors. With this, he planned his next steps. Arrayed and ordered to take full advantage of their foe's weakness, the host of the First Legion advanced in force to meet their enemy. A host of near 30,000 Astartes in full panoply of glory, and with all the brutal weapons of their trade, the full muster of those still combat-capable and not bound to serve in orbit aboard the ships of the fleet. Such a force was a threat that could not be ignored, and the Rangdan, proud and still certain of their superiority, quickly moved to oppose the creatures that dared to invade their home. The two armies met across 100 kilometers of Advex Morza's broken outlands. The initial stages of the battle were fought against the slave legions of the Rangdan by the screening elements of the host of blades and the heavy tanks of the host of iron, warriors ready to counter this by now a familiar Rangdan tactic. Knowing that the true Rangdan would expend their slaves with abandon in order to pinpoint a weakness in the Astartes' lines before attacking, pitting their strength against the weakest point of their opponent, Grandmaster Vendraig had massed his finest warriors, veterans of the hosts of Crowns and Bone, to act as a mobile reserve. Meanwhile, mobile elements of companies led by warriors of the host of Wind, mounted on swift jet bikes and land speeders, isolated and harried the main body of the Rangdan force, and relayed precise information on their movements. Made complacent by Tehran's centuries of conquest and success, the Rangdan elite watched and waited, fully assured that they would claim victory once committed to the fighting against an exhausted and drained foe. Rather than wait for the hammer blow to fall and sunder his formation, Grandmaster Vendraig moved first, leading a charge that burst through the slave soldier battalions and bore down upon their waiting Rangdan overlords. Too proud to retreat in the face of such a challenge, the Rangdan met the warriors of the First Legion blade to blade in a savage melee that tested the mettle of both forces. The stoic brutality and measured swordsmanship of the First Legion matched against the savage might and cruel technology of the Rangdan. Legiones Astartes warriors were cut asunder by Rangdan warriors, enveloped in layers of energy shielding that burned the very air about them as they fought, while the lithe, vulpine Xenos fell before the tyrannic greatswords of the First Legion Terminators. It was a slaughter that would have ended in mutual annihilation, both sides equally matched in skill and power, until Vendraig met the Rangdan Warmaster in single combat. Vendraig was a superlative swordsman, strong of arm and swift in battle, yet his foe was a towering Xenos monster, cloaked in burning energy fields and wielding a huge crystalline blade that bled a neurotoxin of hideous potency. For an hour the duel raged, and as their warriors died around them, the two generals fought with savage ferocity, neither giving an inch. In the end, though racked by the pain of the toxin raging in his blood and his armor rent and sundered, Urian Vendraig slew his foe and held high the severed head of the Rangdan Warmaster. The battle decided, and the pride of that foul Xenos breed broken. With the greatest strength of the foe shattered in open combat by the warriors of the Emperor and their Warmaster a cooling corpse in the dust, those Rangdan that remained fled and took refuge in the fortresses left to them. However, with the Imperium ships consolidating control of orbit, now that the War Moon had been broken, and the Grand Master's host having scattered the greatest strength of their defenses, the Rangdan were a broken force. The next few solar months became a series of grueling sieges, as the First Legion surrounded and reduced each of the Rangdan fortresses by storm, leaving no stone upon stone, and utterly erasing all trace of the enemy on the world they had once claimed. While in orbit, specially equipped carters of breaches and destroyers swept the vast ruins of the War Moon, slaughtering the thousands of Rangdan still trapped in its labyrinthine warrens. Yet the cost of this victory in the first Rangdan Xenocide was staggering, for some 10,000 of the First Legion slain and 50 Imperial ships of the line utterly destroyed, including the irreplaceable Paradigm of Hate, the wreckage of which could not be salvaged from the fused remains of the Rangdan War Moon. This was the legacy the First Legion wished to leave, a symbol of their legion in the barren waste they made of Advex Mors, and a message to those who might seek to oppose them. Those that would seek war with the First Legion would be met by a foe that would not balk when faced with the highest cost to claim victory, a host that would bring an enemy not only to defeat, but to utter annihilation. The Decline of the First. The epic poems and depictions of the Advex Mors campaign were spread across the Imperium by the remembrances that had accompanied the fleet. The First Legion had taken one of the direst threats to emerge from beyond the borders of the Imperium head-on in their place of power, and crushed them utterly and without mercy, leaving no stone upon stone. Yet it was but one great victory among 1,000 others, with each of the legions able to boast of achievements just as impressive. There returned Primarchs forging legends that would resound across the galaxy for thousands of Terran years. Far from ending the strife within the Legion, the Battle of Advex Mors seemed only to deepen the malaise that gripped its heart, a sickness that sought to corrupt that once unparalleled force. Pride had taken hold of the warriors and masters of the Legion, and only blood would assuage its hunger. In the wake of the campaign at Advex Mors, the newly anointed Grand Master sought other badges of glory for his Legion. A dozen victories were claimed for the first, each more reckless than the last, and yet it was still considered nothing more than what was expected by the Divisio Militaris on distant Terra. Driven on by a hunger for glory that grew with each and every campaign honor, the Grand Master and his warriors arrived at the non-compliant stronghold of Carcassonne, a fortress world that had resisted Robert Guilliman and the storied ranks of his elite for almost a solar month. The patient warlord of the Ultramarines had set his strategies, intending to besiege the fortress in detail and save his legion the unwarranted casualties a foolhardy frontal assault would bring. The arrival of Grandmaster Urian van Drake and his warriors did not change the strategy, and the Lord of Ultramar expected them to heed his counsel and join his camp. The warriors of the First, seeing before them a chance to humble the great Primarch, formed ranks before the great kilometers-high gates of the world fortress of Carcassonne and charged. A wedge of black-armored warriors and engines of war, 10,000 strong and preceded by the same great banners that had once gone to war at the side of the Emperor himself, descended upon the city-sized gatehouse. Hundreds fell in the initial assault, blasted apart by rampart cannon and immolated by plasma guards issued forth from hidden murder holes in the fortifications. They forced a breach at the cost of their own lives, opening a path for the heavy guns to burn a hole in the vast gates and into the maze of fortified boulevards beyond. His hand forced by the actions of the First, Guilliman and his own warriors advanced, but slowly, cautiously, taking each objective methodically and with minimal losses. The vanguard of the First Legion soon outpaced them, making for the central plaza and the citadel at its heart. Though they would reach it long before the Ultramarines, a final act of treachery by the desperate overlords of Carcassonne would undermine the First Legion's victory. A hidden atomic mine detonated under the keep's tower and killed the second Grand Master of the First Legion as he stood upon the threshold of triumph, burying both Vendrake and his lifeguard Kada from the host of death. Though their losses had been grievous, both in number and in significance, victory had been seized in the Legion's bloodied grasp, its savor all the more sweet for the price paid to earn it. Yet the Lord of Ultramar, his blue-clad warriors, last to the battle and last to the victory, offered them no words of congratulations. The Primarch did not acknowledge the skills or the fortitude of the First Legion, gave no salute to their bravery or their fallen. Instead, he offered only these words to the battered ranks of the victorious First as they stood about the bodies of their fallen champions. Vainglory is a poor strategist, for he renders triumph a bitter trophy and an empty prize. Today, you have proven the strength of your legion, but not its wisdom. Along a knife's edge. It would be in death that Grandmaster Urian van Drake would finally achieve his aim, for it was the first stirrings of hate that would unite his legion, an animosity that was born with his death and festered in the ignominious victory of Carcassonne. That world was abandoned by the First Legion and left to the warriors of Ultramar, its battle honor excised from Legion records marked on banners only by an empty laurel. The only thing that the Angels of Death would take with them from Carcassonne was a subtle taint, a lingering sense of ignominy that soured their conquests and achievements and drove them to even greater feats to prove their valor. For, despite the deeds of their past and the victory at Carcassonne, the Ultramarines saw them simply as equals, brothers rather than mentors. To the First Legion, whom the Emperor had created first and kept close at his side, this seemed more of an insult than the harsh words of Robert Guilliman. Once more the Council of Masters took the reins of the First Legion, that most potent weapon of war, and split it across the stars to seek vindication in the most deadly contests of arms they could find, each eager to prove the worth of their legion and their host. They gave battle without remorse, and grasped at triumphs without regard for the cost attached to their trophies. The 9th and 14th chapters of the Legion took the coral citadels of Maelnock from the Fraal in a single night of brutal close-quarter slaughter, at a cost of 1/10 of their own strength, in order to outpace the onslaught of the Lunar Wolves elsewhere in the cluster. Upon the rust deserts of Vorsingan, a force of 1,000 initiates of the Host of Iron, gathered from 11 companies and crewing over 400 engines of war, took the field against a throng of brutish orcoid hulks over 3 times their number, running ahead of the main assault force to claim victory for themselves at a fearful prize. Yet, for each victory, each battle honor claimed by the blood of its warriors, the First Legion came no closer to regaining the glory of its inception. All across the galaxy, the Legiones Astartes had each become a unique weapon of war, having taken the doctrines of the Principia Bellicosa developed from the trials of the First Legion's campaigns and surpassed them, adapting them to their own needs. In the realm of Ultramar, the grand kingdom of the Ultramarines, forged by the hand of Guilliman, the Primarch of the 13th Legion, had gone so far as to pen a new treatise of war to improve upon the scheme by which the legions had organized themselves since they had left Terra. The golden age of the First Legion, those halcyon days when it had stood as sole guardian of the fledgling Imperium, had all but ended. The nature of those hidden battles meant they would live on only in the memories of the oldest warriors of the Legion, and in the secret histories of the Imperial archives, a bitter price to pay for the first of all the Emperor's legions that their own honor would ever hold their greatest achievements captive. Pride, which had sustained the Legion through all of the horrors of its past, all of its solitary crusade, valiant last stands, would not allow them to accept a lesser place in the Imperium's order of battle. Pride would see the Legion ground to dust before it would let the younger legions eclipse them. As the Great Crusade drew to its midpoint, the turning of the tide in the Emperor's war to conquer the galaxy, the First Legion stood at a precipice of their own. The years since the death of Grand Master Urian Vendraig had seen them reduced in number, but not in spirit. Where the other legions had prospered and grown stronger, the Angels of Death had seen their power squandered in suicidal assaults and campaigns grueling beyond the ken of mortal soldiers. Those wars had cost them warriors and war engines, more perhaps than was wise, but had honed the fighting skills of its warriors to a keen but brittle edge. To their allies they were grim death-seekers, ever searching for the mightiest foes against which to match their skills, and never retreating from battle, even in the face of annihilation. Its leadership divided among the Council of Masters, and its warriors taken by a fever of battle lust. The Legion was spread across the galaxy and engaged in wars beyond count. Each chapter, host, and order seeking to regain what had been lost. Had it continued down that path, it is likely that the First Legion would have fallen, slowly and inevitably cut to pieces on the double-edged blade of its pride. Yet this was not to be, for a small fleet of Jagatai Khan's roving hunters, White Scars, would discover a world known as Caliban, and the Emperor would bring forth from its dark forests the First Legion's salvation. Lion L. Johnson. As with much knowledge regarding the First Legion and its master, there was a vast body of rumor and little fact regarding the earliest years of the Primarch Lionel Johnson. Before the start of the Great Crusade, the gestation pod containing the infant Primarch that had been mysteriously teleported through the warp from the Emperor's subterranean gene laboratory beneath the Himalayan mountains landed on the feudal death world of Caliban, what would become the Segmentum Obscurus. Caliban was a planet whose surface was largely covered by immense forests, inhabited by terrible, monstrous beasts mutated by the touch of chaos in the centuries after the birth of the chaos god Slaanesh, due to the planet's proximity to the nearby Eye of Terror. Johnson managed to survive in the forests alone, living as a wild man far from civilization. Caliban was home to many knightly orders of warrior aristocrats, created to defend its people and the massive fortress monasteries they lived within to defend themselves from the great beasts. These knights maintained a few aspects of Caliban's ancient technology from before the Age of Strife and wielded primitive bolt pistols and wore suits of simple power armor, very similar to that later used by Legiones Astartes, that were handed down from knight to knight. Despite these technological trappings, however, Caliban remained very much a pre-industrial society whose warriors rode to war on horseback. One of the most prominent knightly organizations was known simply as the Order, and was made up of commoners and nobles alike, whereas the other knightly orders were drawn by tradition only from the Calibanite nobility. Over 150 Terran years later, the young lion would be discovered by a hunting party of the Knights of the Order in the depths of Caliban's forests. Within them dwelt a breed of creature now unknown in the galaxy, monstrous, chimeric weapons left over from the Age of Strife, driven by a hunger that could not be slaked and fully capable of rendering an armored warrior into a ruin of blood and flesh in seconds. How long the young Primarch had survived alone in the green deeps cannot be known for certain, for the lion himself seldom spoke of those times. The knights that found him assumed from his stature and bearing that he could not have spent more than a solar decade alone. But the growth and development of the Primarchs does not follow the pattern of mortal humans, and they do not age as do those untouched by the Emperor's genius. The span of standard years in which the lion prowled Caliban's sea of trees may well have been far longer than can be easily comprehended. Indeed, the legends of those fortified towns that bordered the stretch of forest where the Primarch was discovered spoke of a forest spirit that haunted the depths, a spirit of small stature but whose form was that of a man who was known only by the mysterious marks he left in his wake and had existed for nearly a standard century before the discovery of L. Johnson. Regardless of whether the lion had stalked the world forest of Caliban for a Terran decade or a century, that time had left its mark upon him. The lightless depths beneath the forest canopy teem with horrors, rapacious killers that often emerged from the deeps to hunt among the towns and villages of Caliban's slowly dwindling human population. There, amongst the most foul monstrosities imaginable, the lion spent his childhood. He learned to keep silent, lest he grant advantage to those that stalked him. He learned to fight only when he could win, lest he be wounded too gravely to survive. And he learned that once battle was joined, it could end only in death, that the strong would survive and the weak would fall. He fought for his life with nothing but his bare hands, and a determination so inhumanly strong that it served him better than any iron-forged blade. The lion was no feral berserker, but rather a calculating hunter ruled by logic and not simple rage. When he was discovered at last by the Knights of Caliban, he was judged so dangerous that it might be best to have him slain, treated as one of the great beasts of the forest, so akin to them was he. It was the judgment of one man that would see him brought into the realm of mankind and away from that of beasts, and the man was named Luther. As a champion among the warriors that had defended Caliban through the long years of Old Night, Luther named his new charge Lionel Johnson, which meant the lion, son of the forest, in the Calibanite dialect of Low Gothic, and raised him as a knight of the order. Luther taught him the laws and strictures of the order, to mete out justice as a man rather than as a beast, and gave him something that a young Primarch had never before had, a reason to fight beyond simple survival. Caliban was a dying world, its people besieged by the great beasts that thronged in the hidden depths of the forest and slowly driven to extinction. The Order, which built and manned the great fortresses and the borders of the wild, had vainly tried to stem the tide, but had succeeded only at slowing the pace of their people's destruction, for they were too few to do more than defend their fastnesses from the constant assaults. L. Johnson was taken to the Order's chief fortress monastery of Alderuk and taught human ways. The lion learned to speak incredibly quickly, and soon mastered all of the necessary aspects of Calibanite culture faster than anyone, including Luther, his mentor, foster father and best friend, believed possible. Before long, L. Johnson had become a fierce warrior in the Order's ranks. Though of his years living alone in Caliban's forests, he said nothing, then or later. With Luther at his side, he ultimately rose into the highest ranks of the Order. At the height of his reputation, he made clear his extraordinary ambition. He called for a grand crusade to exterminate the great beasts of Caliban so that the people of his world could finally know peace and live free from fear. This was received with great enthusiasm by the other members of the Order, and even the other knightly orders, but it proved to be a time-consuming process that took nearly a solar decade of constant warfare against the terrible dangers of the deep forests. L. Johnson would quickly prove not only a superlative warrior and strategist, but also a leader whose quiet confidence and iron will drew recruits to the Order in numbers never before seen. With each victory against the great beasts of the forest, each fell head planted upon the walls of the Order's fortresses, more warriors took up arms with hope in more than simple survival. Lionel Johnson stood at the forefront of this new crusade, not by choice, for he had never been taciturn, prone to seek solitude, but by action, always to be found at the fore of any battle and unafraid to speak his mind or act when others might hesitate. By his order, the old traditions that allowed only the nobility to fight among the knightly orders of Caliban were dropped, swelling the Order's ranks further at the cost of some dissent within the ranks of the more traditional knights. Any Calibanite knightly order that did not follow his lead, such as the Knights of Lupus of the Northern Forests, which feared, like many, that the destruction of the great beasts would upend Caliban's traditional social order, was destroyed to the last man. Within the space of solar decades, The Order's ranks had grown to the point that they were able to take the war for their survival ever deeper into the world forest itself. With Lionel Johnson and Luther at their head, they unleashed their crusade to rid Caliban of its curse, bringing flame and steel to the lair of the monsters that had hunted them for generations beyond count. The war was long and bloody, with hundreds slain for each monstrous nest put to the torch. Many grew weary of the slaughter, all save the grim knight, L. Johnson. The Lion knew that mercy had no place in war. To leave with their task unfinished, and with any of the foe yet alive, would be to waste all of their lives spent in its pursuit. There could be only one end, and that was the total annihilation of the enemy by whatever means was needed. L. Johnson set the knights to ambush the great beasts as they came to feed, poisoned the pools at which the creatures drank, and set ablaze vast tracts of the forest to set them to flight. He gave the foe no respite and hunted them till no more could be found, and when his warriors spoke of his prowess and victories, it was fear that colored their words as much as awe. Some of Caliban's aristocracy, following in the wake of the Knights of Lupus, feared his new methods and determination enough to declare open rebellion, some fearing the changes he had wrought upon the tradition-bound people of Caliban, and others simply seeking to claim the power Lionel Johnson had come to wield. These traitors to the cause of Caliban's salvation were put down without mercy, the ranks of their knights and soldiers culled in their entirety, and their fastnesses torn down as a warning to others. At the end of the crusade against the great beasts, both the Lion and Luther exhausted by the terrible cost the fighting had exacted, it was L. Johnson that received the battle honors and the title of Grand Master of the Order. He accepted the accolade without fanfare, for such human eccentricities still seemed less worthwhile to the youth that had grown to manhood among monsters. He understood little the value some placed upon titles and rewards, for his grim and solitary habits had always kept him distant from others, and he saw not the change his rise had wrought in Luther. For where they had once competed as equals for honor and victory, the Primarch had now eclipsed his mentor and brother, leaving him behind as he grudgingly accepted the people's adulation and offered to rule over all of Caliban. It was a wound dealt in ignorance, for L. Johnson did not see the spark of fierce pride that burned within his brother ignite to jealousy in the face of his triumphs, a wound that would fester in the years to follow. Had the Emperor not arrived shortly after this victory, descending from the heavens to claim his lost son, then perhaps this wound might have healed in Caliban's new peace. But this was not to be. The Emperor came to heap new glories upon the Lion, granting him command of the First Legion, whom he renamed the Dark Angels, after an ancient Calibanite myth that spoke to their grim mien, and making him a general within the vast Imperial army that sought to conquer the galaxy. Lionel Johnson would soon leave for distant Terra and his new destiny, bringing his uncompromising and remorseless style of warfare to the ranks of the Imperial forces. To him would fall the role of watchman at the edge of the Emperor's domain, the bane of monsters and beasts, and the bearer of weapons too terrible to entrust to any other. He would be the cold and inevitable destroyer, the doom that once unleashed could not be recalled, subverted or delayed. Taught by the black depths of the forest of Caliban the value of cold, ruthless tenacity. Lionel Johnson was the first of all the Primarchs, war distilled into its rawest and most fundamental essence, death that walked like a man, and the galaxy would be forever changed by his return. The coming of the Emperor. And the angels of darkness descended on pinions of fire and light, the great and terrible Dark Angels. From an ancient Calibanite fable. Shortly after the success of the campaign against the Great Beasts, in 846 M30, the Emperor of Mankind and a small band of his Legiones Astartes scouts, drawn from the First Legion, arrived on Caliban after they detected the psychic emanations of one of the Primarchs. From the moment the Emperor first landed, L. Johnson felt the deep connection between himself and the Master of Mankind, and swore his fealty. In return, the Emperor made him the commander of the First Legion of Space Marines that had been created from his genome. The Emperor had launched his Great Crusade after the end of Old Night to reunite all the lost colonies of humanity and restore mankind's birthright as the rulers of the galaxy. His Space Marine legions purged entire star systems of humanity's Xenos oppressors. As the Imperium's wave of conquest advanced across the galaxy, Imperial scouts brought word that they had rediscovered the isolated world of Caliban, the Segmentum Obscurus, and that it was home to a man who was likely one of the missing Primarchs. Only a small honor guard of the First Legion would accompany the Emperor to Caliban, for the Legion was still scattered to war zones across the front lines of the Great Crusade. A mere 500, mostly veterans of the Host of Death, would precede the Master of Mankind as he journeyed to greet his lost son, the Knight of Caliban, known as the Lion. Arrayed in the jet-black power armor and mortuary symbols that had come to be their mark, it seemed as if the old tales of Calibanite legend and myth had come to life. A host of dark angels mustering before the stronghold of the Order and kneeling before Lionel Johnson. In that initial fateful encounter, the Legion would earn a new title from the first of the Primarchs, for he saw fit to test the mettle of his new followers by personally dueling the captain of the company. The Lion stood against the cataphracti armored warrior and matched his Calibanite steel to the power-field-wreathed blade of his opponent and left him wounded in the dust. The Lion took their measure, and they his, and both learned the respect for the other. From that day forth, the Primarch would call the Astartes of the First Legion his Dark Angels, a title that soon spread throughout the Legion. Within a short span of time, the Emperor arrived at the Order's Fortress Monastery to reclaim his lost gene son in person and induct Caliban formally into the Imperium of Man, its vast forests to be cleared for industry and the first tithes of recruits claimed from among its population to replenish the depleted ranks of the First Legion. The day of the Emperor's arrival was one that would live on for centuries in Calibanite legend. His great vessel descended from the heavens, and he welcomed his lost son back into the Imperial fold. The event was slightly marred by an attempt against the Emperor's life, made by certain conservative knights of the Order who feared the changes that would be wrought to their world by the Imperium and its advanced science and culture. But these malcontents were swiftly and mercilessly executed as traitors by the Astartes. The First Legion's governing council of masters on distant Grammari would soon hear of Lionel Johnson, the man who was their Primarch, and once more they were riven by dissension. Though none would doubt the word of the Emperor, this Knight of Caliban was their true lord. They were split by shame and pride. Some were stricken by remorse at the state of the legion their Primarch would inherit, while others wished to set forth and bring a suitable victory as a trophy to set at the feet of their new master. All across the galaxy, the dispersed units of the First Legion reacted much the same, some detachments redoubling their efforts and throwing themselves into combat with renewed zeal to bring honor to the Legion, while others sought to extricate themselves from their campaigns so they might travel to Caliban and ask forgiveness of their returned Primarch. The Lion himself was brought to Terra by the Emperor, that he might learn of the war the Master of Mankind wished him to prosecute, and of the role he would play for the Imperium in the years to come. Soon, the Space Marines of the First Legion who had accompanied the Emperor to Caliban were putting potential Astartes aspirants from the Order and the other knightly organizations through myriad martial trials and competitions to gauge their level of martial prowess and character. Only the strongest, most dedicated, were allowed to pass to the next stage. Many within the Order whispered that they were competing for a place within the ranks of the Astartes, but these trials also served the secondary purpose of determining if the human strain on Caliban was genetically pure enough to warrant its status as a world the First Legion could recruit from in the coming years. While the Calibanite knightly orders reveled in their differences and often resorted to combat to settle their feuds, the Space Marine legions were united in purpose and will. Such division could not be tolerated, and at the behest of the Lion and the Dark Angels, the individual knightly orders were disbanded and brought under the control of the First Legion. Such a drastic move did not happen overnight, and could not pass without dissenting voices. But when the Lion spoke in favor of the Union of Knights and the glory that would be theirs for the taking in the service of the Emperor, most such voices were stilled. Most, but not all. More objections were raised when the soldiers of the Imperial army descended to the surface of Caliban. The First Legion's aspirant trials had already identified the likely candidates for recruitment into that august body, but the vast majority of the planet's population would still be able to serve the Emperor as troops of the Imperial army. Within an unimaginably short period of time, the surface of Caliban was transformed from a world of sprawling wilderness and castles to one of martial industry that rang to the beat of factory hammers and the tramp of booted feet as its populace girded itself for interstellar war. The Emperor's servants had ascended to Caliban with enormous earth-moving machines that cleared dozens of kilometers of forest a solar day and left flat, lifeless soil in their wake, ready to be planted or built upon. Mines, refineries, and manufactoria followed, ready to transform the planet's abundant resources into vital war material for the Emperor's crusade. Cities were built to supply the sprawling industrial sites, growing upwards and outwards with each passing Terran year, as the traditional villages and towns surrounding the fortress monasteries were emptied and their citizens relocated to better serve the Imperium. Finally, the day arrived when those individuals whose courage had been proven beyond doubt, whose stamina, endurance, and strength had seen them through the Astartes trials, were ready to be added to the ranks of the First Legion. Word had come from Luther that the Astartes had made their final selection for advanced training and the gene enhancement required to join their ranks. Through the application of Imperial science and the marvels of the gene seed, these aspirants are transformed over the next several standard years into battle brothers of the First Legion, the newly named Dark Angels. Luther had also been chosen to join the First Legion by the Astartes, but in common with a large proportion of that initial intake from the Order and the other Calibanite knightly orders, he had been too old to benefit from the implantation of gene seed. In its place, he and others like him had undergone an extensive series of genetic, surgical, and biochemical enhancement procedures designed to increase their strength, stamina, and reflexes to superhuman levels. They were taller, stronger, and quicker than mortal men. But for all that, they were still no true Astartes. It was difficult for Luther and the others to come to terms with that fact, knowing that they were surrounded by those who had once served under them as squires and junior knights, but were now far more powerful than they could ever hope to become. Luther still served as the Lion's second within the Legion, earning his position based on merit and fueled with a desire to prove himself by his devotion to the Imperial ideal. But despite his successes, he could not escape his own inner conviction that he was somehow being looked down upon because he was not a full Astartes. As for Lionel Johnson, his brother Primarchs would come to call him dour and morose, given to dark moods and heedless of the counsel of others. But he saw things simply and starkly. He learned on Terra that the war he had fought in Caliban's monster-haunted forests had not been ended, but only begun, for the galaxy teemed with monsters to be slain. He dedicated himself to one task: killing. He had no time for Sanguinius's chivalric ideals, for Mortarian's arbitrary hatreds, or Fulgrim's obsession with beauty. Such passion only obfuscated the true goal, that the enemies of mankind should be destroyed. As the first of all the Primarchs created by the Emperor, he was both more and less than his brothers, a primal force of destruction whose single-minded focus brought him more inhuman than even Magnus the Red. The Lion could stand against any of his kin, match blades with Fulgrim, and stalemate the strategies of Robert Guilliman, and though some might exceed him in the details of some tasks, there were none that were his equal in the grander scope of battle, none whose will could match the bloody-minded determination of the Lion. His talons and resolute confidence, which some might have called arrogance, won him few friends, but saw him placed at the head of his legion faster than any of the Primarchs to be rediscovered before him. And the legion he inherited was in sore need of its Primarch and in need of a new beginning. Scattered and fractured, the First Legion remained a powerful fighting force, but one whose purpose had become lost in the long years of the Great Crusade. Before the coming of the Primarch, they had been mentors and guides for the younger legions, but their students had long since found their own wisdom. Now, Lionel Johnson would grant them a new purpose, one in keeping with the Primarch's own methods and the vision he had for the Emperor's Great Crusade. His first acts were to merge many of the teachings of Caliban's techno-feudal aristocracy with those of the First Legion Hexagrammaton, fusing the best of Terra and Caliban to create something new and more refined, and to gather the scattered fragments of his legion together. With the first generation of recruits taken from the ranks of the worthy among the Knights of Caliban still undergoing implantation of gene seed, hypnagogic indoctrination, live fire training, the Lion prepared to embark on a crusade of his own. With him were to be found the original 500 warriors that had first arrived at Caliban, as well as those chapters and battle groups that had sought him out to pledge their allegiance, as well as auxiliary companies raised from the stock of Caliban to serve the Imperial army, and a small retinue of Mechanicum Magi from the Forge World of Xana too, eager to court favor with the new Primarch. In full, they numbered 20,000 warriors, perhaps a third of the Legion, each marked by the new beginning they were pledged to, adorned with the winged sword of Lionel Johnson's Dark Angels instead of the grim marks of an age now ended. The Lion led this host forth, seeking out those companies of his gene sons that had not yet found their way to his side, to find those scattered warriors amid the chaos of the Great Crusade, a war waged across a galaxy by 10 billion warriors under arms, was no small feat, made possible only by the genius of the Lion himself and the arts of the tech adepts of Xana, who quickly passed the databanks of the Divisio Militaris to discern in which campaigns the First Legion bled and died. For any other legion, the arrival of their newly rediscovered Primarch might have been the cause for raucous celebration or ostentatious parades, but not so for the grim First. News of Lionel Johnson's approach most often spurred the warriors of the First Legion to redouble their efforts in battle, throwing themselves upon the foe without care for their survival, so that when they stood before their Gene Father, they might offer him the blood-soaked laurels of victory. Each battle-worn company received their new master with the same stoic reserve, with silent curtsy and brief but solemn vows of allegiance, and each was tested in battle by the Primarch himself before they joined the ranks of his growing entourage. As was the way of the Lion, he demonstrated his worth by his actions and skill rather than with words and vague promises, allowing those who might doubt him to match their blades against his honest combat. None among the Legion could question his right to lead after such a trial, though some few within the Legion harbored misgivings at the sudden changes the Primarch brought to the centuries-old doctrines of the Legion and the shift in authority he represented. Within a few short standard years, the Lion had gathered the vast majority of his Legion together, near 100,000 warriors, and led them to the ancient stronghold of the First Legion on Grammari. There, the gathered council of masters and preceptors conclave awaited him, amid the many glories of the First Legion's long and glorious history and the amassed wisdom distilled from its battles. Here, surrounded by the dusty trophies of the past, Lionel Johnson made his Legion whole once again. He faced the ceremonial champion of the Council of Masters in the Ring of Honor, battling Pyrrhus Caligat, the master of the Host of Fire, in an hour-long duel that has since become legend. This final trial ended, the Primarch accepted the titles of Grand Master of the First Legion, the 6 Wings of the Hexagrammaton, and High Preceptor of the Orders Militant of the First Legion, the first warrior to consolidate the leadership of the entire Legion under one banner. To the gathered warriors of the Dark Angels, whose oaths had now been sworn in blood and sacrifice, the new Primarch swore an oath of his own, an oath to seal the pact between them. This oath is recorded in the books of the Council of Masters. We are the Angels of Darkness. For us there is no peace, no end, but war and death. We shall not walk in the golden halls of mankind's future, but stand resolute in the shadows beyond. While we yet draw breath, this Imperium will not fall, and we will not know defeat. For I pledge every warrior, every drop of blood in the Legion, in the name of victory, no matter the cost. The reorganization of the First Legion. With his oath to his legion sworn, Lionel Johnson saw the rise of his Dark Angels, placing new masters over each of the wings he had created from the bones of the Legion's old hosts, and formalizing the Angels' various informal orders in the style of Caliban's knightly orders. With the first influx of new recruits from Caliban now ready to join the First Legion, comprising those older warriors like Luther that had opted to undergo the painful and unreliable cybernetic and genetic augmetic enhancement process that allowed them to reach levels of ability comparable to true Space Marines, Lionel Johnson swiftly incorporated them within this new structure, taking care to assign posts and commands based only on merit and not due to origin or the simple virtue of time in service. A number of the Lion's old companies from the Order found positions within his inner circle, and despite the stringent trials the Lion insisted upon, some of the oldest veterans were less than pleased to yield their authority to these comparative newcomers. The old Grand Legion Chantry on Grammari was torn down, replaced with a more modest fortress to secure the industrial sprawl of that world. For though the Legion would maintain a great fortress monastery on Caliban, its true heart and seat of power would be the sanctum of its Primarch aboard his flagship, the ancient Gloriana-class battleship Invincible Reason. For many, this reinvigoration of the Legion served to dispel the malaise that had long lain over the First, discarding the vainglory that had sapped the worth from victory and embracing the purity of the Primarch's vision. Though, for a silent minority of veterans, the sudden and jarring dissolution of old traditions and the introduction of new Calibanite blood left a lingering sense of doubt. The Lion chose to confront any intransigence with the stoic indifference that was his hallmark, choosing to immerse the Legion in war and trust that his example would dispel any doubt. Dispersed under the masters and knight commanders of the Legion, he set the Dark Angels to their task, while the Primarch led his own fleet to answer a call for aid received only recently by the newly installed astropathic Qua at Caliban. His destination was the distant world of Carcassam, where the Ultramarines garrisoned there had resisted siege for over 8 solar months after a sudden uprising against Imperial rule among the population living within the ruined halls of the shattered world fortress. The desperate rebels had opened hidden vaults deep beneath the surface of the planet and set loose a biogenic phage that had reshaped the broken people of their world into twisted, blood-hungry ghouls whose minds were burned clean of all thought except the need to hunt and kill. These monstrous mutant creations then fell upon the unsuspecting warriors of the 13th Legion with a ferocity that gave pause to even the warriors of the Legiones Astartes. With much of the Great Crusade's strength concentrated to the galactic east, there were few forces available to relieve the beleaguered Ultramarines. Given the history of Carcassonne, few expected the Dark Angels to return. So, when the Invincible Reason broke through the Imperium and entered real space, its drop bays already open and primed for launch, Praetor Arteon of the 13th, the commander of the all but overrun Astartes garrison, lost for a moment the famous stoic reserve of the Ultramarines and cried out for joy at the sight. The Lion himself was at the forefront of the relief force, cutting a path through the teeming hordes of flesh ghouls that threatened to overrun the Ultramarines. At the head of 1,000 ebon-armored veterans of the Dreadwing, the new master of the First Legion made swift work of the foe. A curtain of superheated plasma scouring clean the walls and bunkers of the Ultramarines' fortress. At his heels came the full force of the fleet, 10,000 transhuman warriors of the Dark Angels. By their blades was the enemy put to rout, then annihilated as they cowered in their bolt holes. When the Ultramarines sallied forth from their fortifications to meet them among the sea of corpses and ash, they did so with some trepidation, perhaps expecting some measure of retribution for the last meeting between their legions at Carcassonne, or a demand to cede the world to the First Legion in return for their aid. Yet the Lion had no interest in old grudges or the tawdry business of accolades and honors, and with the killing complete, he left without fanfare, leaving behind only an empty banner to mark the Dark Angel's debt to the Ultramarines paid. That this was among his first battles was no accident, but a statement of his intent. He was not to play at politics, not to build empires nor monuments. He was pledged to war and death, to kill the enemies of the Emperor and nothing else. And so it was, this doctrine in mind, that Lionel Johnson and his Dark Angels took up their duties in the latter days of the Great Crusade. The late Great Crusade. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. Attributed to the Emperor of Mankind, to the 6 hosts at their embarkation upon the expeditionary fleets during the outset of the Great Crusade in circa 798 M30. 20 legions of Space Marines were created by the Emperor during the Great Crusade to join and lead his quest to unite all of humanity under the aegis of the Imperium of Man. The nascent proto-legion known as the Primus, or First Legion, later renamed after a series of cognomens including the First, the Angels of Death, and the Uncrowned Princes, as the Angelis Tenebraium, or Dark Angels, was the very first of those original first founding legions to be created at the beginning of the Great Crusade. The First Legion was raised first to active service in a staged process of testing and trials before the full active force was created through mass recruitment. Each stage of creation resulted in an expansion of the gene seed implantation on progressively larger groups of neophytes. During the unification wars on Terra, they were the first of the Space Marine legions to be created, and were therefore originally under the command of the Emperor himself. Once the Emperor discovered Lionel Johnson on Caliban, however, the Primarch took command of the Dark Angels Legion that had been created from his genetic stock, and he was granted command of the 4th Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade. The Compliance of Molech. One of Lionel Johnson's earliest campaigns as commander of the newly dubbed Dark Angels Legion was the Imperial compliance of the newly discovered night world of Molech. This was a massive joint compliance operation between multiple Legiones Astartes, including the Dark Angels, Lunar Wolves, Emperor's Children, White Scars, and thousands of Imperialis Auxilia soldiers, various Mechanicum and Legio Titanicus assets. Cyprian Devine of House Devine was named planetary governor of Molech. In the presence of several of his Primarch sons, the Emperor led them to a warp gate hidden underground, where he proceeded to utilize it to enter into the realm of chaos to parley with the ruinous powers. When he finally returned, the Emperor appeared aged, but much more powerful. Then psychically suppressed his son's memories of Molech and stationed a large garrison force comprised of nearly 100 Imperialis Auxilia regiments, 3 Legio Titanicus cohorts, along with detachments from 2 Space Marine legions to protect the secrets of the Warp Gate on Molech. The 2nd and 3rd Rangdan Xenocides. Next, the Dark Angels took part in the vital campaigns of the final Rangdan Xenocides. They fought alongside Titans from the Legio Griffonicus, Legio Vulturum, as well as other Zanide Mechanicum forces from the Forge World of Xana II. The conflict began in 862 M30, when the Rangda, that Xenos terror long thought extinguished in the earlier first Rangdan Xenocide, fell upon the northern reaches of the Imperium in numbers that defied belief. For almost a solar decade, the veterans of the First Legion, now the Dark Angels, fought to hold at bay an enemy that threatened to consume all the worlds of mankind. The Lion wrought his own legend in those dark times, a grim figure of death and vengeance that descended upon the Rangda in a cold fury. In the first dire standard years of the conflict, when the Imperium seemed lost in a tide of Xenos fiends and their slaves, the Lion stood tall amid the carnage. He was no golden hero like his brother Sanguinius, nor a black-humored figurehead like Horus Lupercal, but rather a silent rock, unyielding in the storm. He did not inspire loyalty nor any other virtue. Rather, he went forth where the foe was strongest, armored by his pride and confidence, and drew others along with him for the simple honor of standing by his side. For near a solar decade, the battles would rage, some 9 Space Marine legions taking part in the fighting, and ravaging human colonies across the northern sectors of the Imperium. Of those legions caught up in the fighting, many would suffer serious losses. The Space Wolves, making the loss of some 5,000 Astartes, breaking the siege of Xana alone. The Dark Angels, gathered once again in almost their full number, bore a toll of their own. The Dark Angels hurled themselves at their enemies, and broke their greater strength in countless battles against the vile Xenos on the edge of the Halo stars. This campaign culminated in the 3rd Rangdan Xenocide around 890 M30, which resulted in the loss of the lives of 50,000 Dark Angel Space Marines, spent in preventing the destruction of perhaps the entire Northern Imperium by the alien menace from the outer darkness. At the breaking of the great citadel of Vorksag, during the vast clash of void ships over Morkar and the 7 solar week-long Battle of Moreau, where 3 companies of the Dark Angels held against more than 1 million Rangdan Nero-shackled servitors, victory was brought at the cost of their lives, with the blood of the old Legion. But when victory was at last proclaimed, the Rangdan menace vanquished for the final time, Dark Angels were but the 10th of their old number. Some say the old Legion fought to prove themselves worthy of their new master. Others that they bled to make right their failure to destroy the Rangda when first they met at the Battle of Advex Moors. And a few whispered that the Lion sent them into slaughter so he might replace them with more tractable Calibanite warriors. Whether true or not, it was to Caliban that the Lion turned to replenish the ranks of his legion. With the Rangdan plague driven back, the first new influx of true Calibanite space marines entered the ranks of the legion, where once they had been but the few older companions of the Primarch. Now they were dispersed across all the wings and orders of the Legion. They were a new breed of warrior for the First Legion, guided more by tradition and ritual than their forebears, and unburdened by the weight of pride that had been the lodestone of the Tehran veterans. In the wake of the Second Rangdan Xenocide, it was this changed Legion that went forth to continue its works to bring war to the most fell of foes. From Caliban they spread out across the stars, for unlike many of their brethren, they took few strongholds, save for the lonely chantry halls that held the knowledge of the Legion. Each of their expeditionary fleets was bound to a different corner of the Imperium, to patrol the dark places where monsters were still to be found. The Lion took command of one such fleet, no larger or more grand than any other, for he expected each to be an engine of death, capable of defeating any foe, and set course for the world known to Imperial cartographers as Sarosh. Due to the extensive losses suffered by the First Legion during the Rangdan Xenocides by 899 M30, the Ultramarines Legion were on the cusp of becoming the largest Space Marine Legion, standing at around 166,000 legionaries. The Feud of Dulan. As the Space Marine Legions pushed back the frontiers of the Imperium, each Primarch strove to excel in the eyes of the Emperor, and none more so than Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves. Only Horace Lupercal and Lionel Johnson could claim more victories than Russ. This was a constant frustration for him. It was on the world of Dulan, in 870 M30, where the Space Wolves were fighting alongside the Dark Angels, that matters came to a head. This incident would start the millennia-long rivalry between the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves. The planetary governor of Dulan, Durath, had denounced the Space Wolf Primarch Leman Russ as the Emperor's lapdog, and swore to feed his heart to his pet Grox. Russ, enraged, swore to kill Durath himself, and demanded the satisfaction of leading the assault. Johnson, however, had meticulously planned the attack, was not about to let his brother's hot-headedness foil his plans. Johnson led the assault, leaving Russ to watch helplessly as the Lion killed Durath. After the battle, Russ stormed into the fortress and struck Johnson across the room. A brawl ensued that lasted a full solar day and night, the two combatants being said to be equally matched. While Russ was slightly stronger, the Lion slightly quicker. Russ eventually ceased and started laughing, realizing how foolish their fight was and how he had allowed his pride and temper to get the better of him. Johnson, however, still angry at what he considered the treachery of Russ's first punch, knocked the laughing Space Wolf out cold with one final blow. By the time Russ regained consciousness, the Dark Angels had departed for new fields of battle in the Great Crusade. It has since been customary for selected champions from both chapters to engage in a non-lethal duel whenever they meet, so that honor may be satisfied. The Battle of Dulan in the infamous feud between Dark Angel and the Space Wolves is a tale told many times. In essence, it is always recounted as a simple tale, yet one that has seen a number of tellings, each of which has had its own agenda. Rarely has that agenda been the simple truth. The details of the battle are well known as noted in the most common retelling. Leman Russ and Lionel Johnson were both assigned to the conquest of the world of Delan. While the Space Wolves waited and lay siege, the Dark Angels staged a sudden assault that allowed them to claim the honor of the final victory. On hearing of this, it is most often claimed that Leman Russ flew into a rage and assaulted his brother, leading to the legendary duel between them that their Legion's successor chapters are rumored to reenact whenever they meet. This has led to the popular assumption of a bitter grudge between the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels, a sense of lasting ill will brought about by this single isolated incident that has been accepted by history as fact. Yet those two legions and their later successor chapters fought together on a number of occasions, both before and after the Battle of Dulan, without rancor and in many cases with a noted sense of shared camaraderie. Indeed, it has often been noted that the two Primarchs, Lionel Johnson and Leman Russ, were of much the same character, though they oft expressed it differently. Both were practical to their core, with little time for frivolity or the excesses of civilization. Both valued plain speaking over political necessity, and judged men and women by the actions they took rather than the words they spoke. But above all, the two Primarchs placed the utmost value on loyalty, holding their oaths as iron bonds and reserving the deepest hate for those who would forsake a vow. This being true, it throws the events on Delan and the grudge they are supposed to have given birth to into a strange light. That the two fought is not in doubt, for too many sources agree on it. That either came to hold a grudge is implausible. If anything, the record of the two Primarchs suggests a deep bond of trust and mutual respect. Together, they had seen the end of the Rangdan Empire, had conquered 1,000 worlds, and vanquished some of the most terrible foes to stand against the Imperium. Delan would seem to have represented one of many tests, a test that allowed the two to take a measure of each other, and a test oft repeated when they or their warriors met, but one repeated without the rancor often attributed to it. There exists no greater symbol of the loyalty between the two legions, the Wolves of Fenris and the Knights of Caliban, than in the final days of the rebellion against the Emperor, when Horus himself trembled as the two legions reunited as brothers in arms, ready to test themselves against the forces that lay siege to Terra. The subjugation of Sarosh. The Dark Angel's 4th Expeditionary Fleet under the command of Lionel Johnson took part in the continued compliance of Slaanesh, officially codified as Sigma 517, but known to the Dark Angels as 4-3, the third world brought to compliance by the 4th Expeditionary Fleet, which had formerly been commanded by an officer of the White Scars Legion. Lionel Johnson went in answer to call for aid from his brother, Jagatai Khan. Of all the Primarchs, the Khan stood closest to the Lion, for despite their differences, each appreciated the honest and forthright nature of the other, and so the Lion was ill-disposed to ignore his call. The Sarosi, ruled by a planetary bureaucracy, had recently expressed their interest in becoming part of the Imperium, and the Imperials were eager to allow them in, believing that these people seemed to possess the same secular beliefs as they did in the Imperial truth. But over a standard year had passed, and the Sarosi were as yet no closer to attaining compliance, constantly apologizing to the Imperial planetary governor chosen for their world, Harlad First, that their bureaucracy was slowing the process. But the Sarosi, without mentioning it to the Imperial expedition, secretly worshipped chaos entities in the warp they called the Melachim, and saw the anti-religious stance of the pre-heresy Imperium's Imperial truth as unsuppressed evil. After the Dark Angel's fleet arrived in orbit to accelerate the compliance process, the Lord High Exactor, the leader of the Sarosi bureaucracy, who had been invited aboard the Invincible Reason to meet the Primarch, denounced L. Johnson and the Emperor to the Primarch's face aboard the Dark Angel's flagship, and L. Johnson responded by ramming his power sword through the fanatical Sarosi leader's body. But the Sarosi delegation had also brought a hidden nucleonic device aboard the shuttle, intending to assassinate the fleet's entire command structure, including L. Johnson, in one fell swoop. However, Luther and the junior librarian named Zahariel El-Zurias managed to reject the shuttle into space, causing only minor damage to the flagship. Luther admitted to Zahariel that he had discovered the device earlier, and had, briefly, considered allowing it to kill his oldest friend, largely because of the jealousy that had begun to grow in his soul. The rebels on Slaanesh would be crushed for their treachery, brought to heel swiftly by the might of the Dark Angels and the Imperium's armies. But the victory would leave a bitter taste for many. In the aftermath of the fighting, some questioned the ease with which the Sarosi had infiltrated the First Legion's defenses, and though none would call what had occurred treachery, there were those whose devotion to the Legion's new path was questioned. Luther, Zahariel, and 500 other Dark Angels drawn from among the veterans of both Tara and Caliban were to find themselves returned to Caliban, not in exile, but neither in triumph. There, they were to serve as a garrison force, the overseers of the Lion's Sanctuary, and to continue the recruitment of new Space Marines into the Legion from the Calibanite population. They were required to leave the Great Crusade behind, regardless of their legacy of standard years in service in either the Calibanite forest or among the stars. This was the determination of the Lion, that he would set aside even those whom he held dearest in the name of duty. Some would name it arrogance, and others, with the benefit of hindsight, would call it foolhardy, but it was ever the way of the Lion. It was not the cold logic of battle favored by some among the Primarchs, but the proud imperative of duty and excellence that those who faltered be set aside, no matter how justified or small the failing, and the worthy grow stronger through the trials they faced. The final days of the Crusade. By this creed of strength and excellence, the First Legion, the Dark Angels, lived and died, continuing the work of the Emperor in the last days of the Great Crusade. Wherever the tide of Imperial conquest slowed, they were to be found, bright swords and grim resolve against the worst horrors of the galaxy. Lionel Johnson, now long parted from the forests of Caliban, and a staunch believer in the dream of human empire embodied in his Gene father, fought with every moment given to him. He spent no time on parades, fortress building, or in petty squabbles with his kin, but went stoically from battle to battle. He and his legion began to shun the gatherings of the Great Crusade and the fellowship of their brothers among the Legiones Astartes, scorning those who would fret over such frivolities while there remained enemies of power and strength to test their mettle against. As the years and wars wore on, a distance grew between the Dark Angels and the other legions of the Imperium. Few of the Primarchs cared to take the time to seek out their reclusive brother, as he and his legion continued to whet their blades to a keen edge. They began to forget the deeds he and his warriors had performed, for he rarely spoke of them. All except one. Horus Lupercal, ever watchful, paid much heed to his brother and the actions of his legion. Once he had tried to bind the First Legion to him, only to find the cipher of their ways a shield against his influence, and their pride a foil to his manipulation. His and Lorgar's warrior lodges would find no purchase within the ranks of the Dark Angels, as they were shunned by the preceptors of the Orders Militant and the proctors of the wings of the Hexagrammaton as worthless and beneath them. The Dark Angels were not and never could be Horus's to command. The Dark Angels' master was, as his legion, a rock in which Horus Lupercal could find no crack or chink in which to fix his barbs, no psychological leash by which he could lead him along paths of his own choosing. The Lion was not well liked among the Brotherhood of the Primarchs, but he had the respect of each and every one of his brothers. More than that, he had the trust of his father, the Emperor, and the keys to the hidden and ancient arsenals of Terra. Were the Emperor to choose a single one among his Primarchs to lead, to stand at the head of the Great Crusade, then Lionel Johnson was a choice easily understood, and this troubled the Master of the Lunar Wolves. So, when the conquest of Ullanor Prime loomed before Horus in M30, he was sure to see the Lion and the First Legion diverted to far battlefields, and tendered him no invitation to the great triumph of Ullanor that followed. So it was that when Horus was crowned as the War Master of the Imperium, the Lion was not present, a victory to the covetous mind of the new War Master. And yet, this was one of the few miscalculations made by the shrewd intellect of the War Master. He counted all men of power to think as he did, yet while the Lion and the Wolf of Luna shared many traits, they were not the same. When news of Horus's new rank reached Lionel Johnson, he did not pause in his campaigns, nor did he offer congratulations or lament his own fortune. This, more than the reaction of any of his other brother Primarchs, gave the War Master pause. When Horus's thoughts later turned to rebellion and treachery after his fall to chaos in the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin, it is likely that it was the Lion he marked as among the greatest of threats to his plans. The Dark Angels were both numerous and skilled in all the arts of war, with access to the armories of Terra and Psi Arcana forbidden to all others. And their Primarch was as inflexible as iron, loyal beyond doubt to the Emperor, and resolute enough to rise up against any threat to his father's grand dream of human unity. As with all of the Primarchs, the War Master did not feel fear as did lesser mortals, but the thought of facing Lionel Johnson in open battle gave him pause, and if he would not be turned to the traitor's cause, then he must be removed. There were 3 Space Marine Legions horrors sought to remove from the path of his heresy before it began. The White Scars he hoped to preserve for his own use, the Blood Angels he hoped to destroy or corrupt, but the Dark Angels he hoped to banish, to send far enough away that by the time they could return, his grim business would be complete. This was not to be, for the Lion would return to the Imperium as the sun returns to the horizon each morning, blinding and implacable, and he would reach for the heart of his fallen brother. Horus had loosed a beast the equal of any that lurked in the world-straddling forests of Caliban or the silent dark between the stars, one that would tear apart the Imperium, if only to grasp a victory of ashes and blood.